Today we're going to the leading edge here and talking about a paper from the July 2020 issue of Computers and Human Behavior, Individual Differences in Susceptibility to Cybercrime Victimization and its Psychological Aftermath by Cheng, Chan, and Chau. It should go without saying that the use of information technology such as the internet has risen quite a bit in the last few decades, so it should also be no surprise that the instances of cybercrime, such as identity theft and stealing nude photos, have also increased in frequency. In simple terms, the exposure hypothesis is that the more exposure you have to the potential of a said crime, the greater the likelihood you have of being the victim of said crime. To use a real-world example, as a bicycle commuter who leaves his bike unattended in public for hours on end, I have a greater likelihood of getting my bike stolen than someone who leaves their bike locked and at home and only takes it out for fun rides. The exposure hypothesis itself derives from lifestyle theory, which posits that different lifestyles are associated with differential risks to be the victim of a crime. But I want to be clear, this is purely probabilistic. Just because one habit makes you more likely to be the victim of a crime does not necessarily mean you will be one. Lifestyle theory was originally developed for real-world crimes such as theft, but recent work has explored whether it applies to the digital world. Some researchers argue that inherent differences between the cyber world and real world make it such that the theory won't extend, but others counter that cybercrimes, like real-world crimes, capitalize and exploit lifestyle choices, so it should still hold. As an extension of the exposure hypothesis, the authors predicted that people who considered themselves more proficient in their use of technology would use it more, and thus increase their exposure. This increased exposure, then, would be associated with an increased risk of cybercrime victimization. They operationalized this hypothesis with this mediation model. In contrast to the overconfidence hypothesis, Cheng et al. Postulated the negligence hypothesis. In sum, those who are highly competent will use technology more intelligently and thus reduce their exposure to potential cybercrime. To return to my bike theft example, as someone who regularly leaves my bike out, I know to deploy some serious locks, so I am less susceptible to bike theft even though I leave my bike out more often. The negligence hypothesis further argues that since everyone is at high exposure to cybercrime these days, those with high proficiency will shield themselves better, thus their effective exposure is lower. In theory, to have an instance of a crime, you need a susceptible victim, an absence of guardianship, and the presence of a perpetrator. So highly proficient individuals would not have an absence of guardianship and thus be at lower risk. These risk factors are important because of the far-reaching psychological effects of cybercrime. Victims may place less trust in technology and the internet. Furthermore, they may feel they have less control of their outcomes, view the world as less fair, and experience lower subjective well-being. To test all these hypotheses, the authors collected a sample of over 1,000 people living in Hong Kong through random digit dialing. This method is an excellent way to get as close to a truly random sample as possible. However, as such, they got a quite diverse sample demographically. I'm not going into the weeds here, but if you're curious, it's all laid out in the paper. The main limitation of this type of sampling are that it limits the length of survey you can administer and that participants may not be as honest with you as they would be in, say, an anonymous internet survey. During the phone interview, they asked participants if they had been a victim of any of the 10 most common types of cybercrime, from online game-related to shopping fraud to social media deception. They were coded as yes-no, and then the aggregate scores were taken as the sum of yes responses. They used the Internet Self-Efficacy Scale, which is exactly what it sounds like. Other variables of interest were measured using scales developed for the most recent World Values Survey. And now results. I am grateful that the authors seem to have presented all the various analyses they ran, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to present those most central to their hypotheses. First up is the exposure hypothesis. They did find that exposure significantly predicted victimization, which is in line with the authors' predictions. To test mediation, they used Hayes' process macro, which is thankfully becoming the standard method for analyzing a mediation. The old way of doing this was to simply run two regression analyses, one with only the predictor and one with both the mediator and the predictor. Then you would compare the stated beta coefficients of the predictor from the first model to the second. The theory is that if that coefficient does drop, your mediator is explaining some of the variance shared between your predictor and your outcome. The problem with that is that when you have mediation, you are violating one of the assumptions of multiple regression, since your predictors are sharing variance. Also, you couldn't know whether that drop was significant. Process solves all of those problems. If you would like a more basic explanation of mediation, see my video on Muse et al.'s 2015 paper on sexual frequency and well-being. As to the current paper, they found a significant positive indirect effect of self-efficacy through exposure which supports the overconfidence hypothesis. In other words, people with higher IT self-efficacy are more likely to be the victims of cybercrime because they use technology more often. In their analysis of how trusting the victims of cybercrime were of others, they found that following the cybercrime, the subjects only reported a reduction in trust of people on the internet. So this effect seems to be domain-specific rather than general. Regarding emotional consequences, they found that victimization was negatively correlated with perceived control, negatively correlated with perceived fairness, negatively correlated with subjective well-being, negatively correlated with subjective life satisfaction, and negatively correlated with happiness. In sum, lifestyle theory does seem to extend into the cybersphere. That is, increased use of technology is associated with an increased risk of cybercrime. Also, we now have hard scientific evidence that being the victim of cybercrime is correlated with some not-so-great psychological outcomes. Furthermore, this study seems to show that highly proficient individuals are at greater risk than not-so-proficient users, since they use computers and the internet a lot more. However, I would like to come back to the negligence hypothesis for a bit. Based on my read of the paper, I'm not sure a mediation model is really the best way to operationalize it. To my mind, it would make more sense to run IT self-efficacy as a moderator such that the association between exposure and incidence of cybercrime is different for high proficiency individuals and low proficiency individuals. I just don't really see the overconfidence and negligence hypothesis as being necessarily mutually exclusive. It could be that on average high self-efficacy are at greater risk than low self-efficacy for reasons explained in this study, but the highly proficient folks are at less risk than they otherwise would be were they not highly proficient. This study has a few other limitations that are worth noting. The authors note that cybercrime was measured in a rather coarse fashion. Theoretically, it is possible that being the victim of different types of cybercrime could have different effects. Also, they did not measure how often someone had been a victim of a specific type, just whether they had or not. This possibility reduced the total variance in their data. I would also like to note that the Internet Self-Efficacy Scale does not have any items related to cybersecurity. It could be that proficiency in using the Internet and proficiency in using the Internet safely are two separate things. And finally, this is a cross-sectional correlational study. We don't have any directionality or causation. As to future research, I would like to see some more work examining the negligence hypothesis for reasons I've already stated. I don't think the authors quite had enough to disprove it. A more obvious direction would be to move into longitudinal, maybe even quasi-experimental studies. Cardfelt-Winter suggested that individuals low in IT self-efficacy might compensate by using technology more frequently and thus getting themselves into trouble by not using it well. Longitudinal design might suss out whether this is the case, or the authors' suggestion that high proficiently leads to increased use, which in turn leads to increased risk. As to something quasi-experimental, some rather advanced techniques have been recently developed that allow us to do some rather sophisticated participant matching, and thus allow us to get as close to a true experimental design as possible when studying topics like this one, in which it would be unethical to run such a true experiment. I would also like to see some research attempting to differentiate IT self-efficacy and cybersecurity self-efficacy. I genuinely don't know if the two are actually different, but it is a possibility that might alter how we view the results of this paper. And finally, I wonder if the association between IT use and cybercrime risk is actually curvilinear. It could be that once you reach a certain point, your risk doesn't really increase. I don't know where that point would be, but it's worth exploring. Well, anywho, thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've got a paper you'd like me to dissect, let me know in the comments.